Does your bike still have a shitty stock cam? I got a tech tip on how to get a little bit more power. So what's up guys, Tony from Tucker Speed here. Now that I've dished out a free tech tip on the best thing to do with the stock cam, I'm going to show you how to install a cam in an M8. We're going to be installing a Woods WM8 22XD with an S&S plate, pump, and all the supporting parts. I'm going to walk you through step-by-step process here with adjustable push rods, and we'll also be tuning this bike afterwards. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and jump into the disassembly, get everything pulled off. Before I start to reassemble and install everything, I'll kind of go through and we'll talk about all the parts that we're installing, what's included in the kit that we put together for this guy. And also stay tuned. At the end of the video, I'm gonna talk about the dyno numbers. I put this bike on the dyno when we did a base run as it rolled in. This bike does have a HPI air cleaner and 2-into-1 pipe on it, but I have a base power pull, so we'll know exactly kind of what this Woods 22XD adds to the bike. So stay tuned to the end of the video. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of blast this thing apart. I'm going to get the air cleaner, the throttle body, the footboard, the exhaust off, and then we'll get the push rods out. We're going to use the technique of cutting the push rods out. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Okay, so as far as tools that you're going to need for this job, obviously you can see a lot of stuff here. All your basic stuff, you're going to need a good set of Allens, both standard and at least, a 5 to pull your throttle body off. So you need a metric set, wrenches, ratchets, pliers, kind of all your basic stuff. Some of the specialty things needed, the Feuling crankshaft runout tool. I guess it's not a must, but it is nice to do when you have everything disassembled, but the job can be done without that. You are going to need a sprocket locker to be able to torque your cam and pinion shaft bolts. You will need inner cam bearing remover and installer. That's going to be an important one. I would highly recommend getting that stock bearing out of there if it's prone to failure. Pushrod keeper tool is really handy. And then, just some elastics with paper clips to hold the pushrod tubes up. I think that covers everything important. A couple of feeler gauges for the tappet cuffs. This is a 2 and 3 thou feeler gauge that I just pulled out of the stack. Obviously, Loctite, assembly lube, shop rags, pretty basic stuff. So drop a comment or a question below if you have any questions. All right, I'm getting ready to pull this exhaust off. One thing I see a lot of guys do when they're trying to remove their exhaust is they don't want to try and find the plug to disconnect the O2 sensor. So I see them like try and twist them out and just twist the wires up and everything. It's really not that bad. Just follow the wires back. Both the O2 sensors plug in under the right side cover here. They are color coded. Black is the back. The kind of gray whitish plug is the front cylinder. I'll snip off all these zip ties and the front cylinder O2 sensor wire just runs along the frame here. It's clipped in a couple of plastic clips. I got a zip tie here on the pressure sensor. So now that there's nothing worse than trying to pull the exhaust and then realizing they're still connected. So I just make sure those are out, loose, not a problem for later. So I'm gonna get this muffler pulled off. Okay, I got the pipe, the intake, throttle body off. My next step is I'm gonna get these pushrod tubes collapsed and then we're gonna cut the pushrods out. Get these pushrod tubes out. All right, so when I cut these, I like to make sure that there's not any spring tension on them. So if you can spin it, you're good to go. So I just got some bolt cutters here. I'm just gonna go ahead and cut these out. Just be careful you don't mar up like your lifter cover, your pushrod tube. I also have the world's worst bolt cutters. So that one's also free spinning. So that one's good to go. That means I'll have to rotate the motor over on the rear cylinder. So I'll get this other front push rod out. All right, so this back one has a little slight tension on it. I'm actually gonna just roll the motor over. All right, so I put it up. I got the spark plugs out. I'm gonna go ahead and roll the motor over with the rear wheel. You can see it moving the push rods. So right there, both of those are spinning free. So I can go ahead and cut them out. All right, so I got the push rods cut out. Remember to remove your O-rings. I like to just pull the ones out of the heads out right now so I don't forget. Okay, I'm gonna get these lifter covers out of the way. I'll get the cam, I'm gonna go ahead and pull the cam cover, let it start to drain. I got a drain pan here, catch the oil, and I'll let it drain while I get the lifter blocks. All right, so I got all my bolts out of the cam cover, but it is a little bit stuck. If yours is stuck, just go ahead and just give it a light tap like a rubber mallet. Just get stuck to the gasket. All right, while that drains, I'm gonna work on my lifter covers. Okay, so I got the lifter block, or the lifter cover screws off, kind of like the cam cover. They're kind of stuck on there. Let's take this rubber mallet and give them a little tap. All right, so here's a critical point in the disassembly process here. This tappet cuff bolt is prone to snapping in half. They've like over Loctited them, or they've done something at the factory, and you'll go to loosen it and it'll twist the bolt in half, leaving the broken half down inside the case, which is gonna make your life very problematic. So in this case, that is very funny, isn't it, Fred? In this case, we're using the S&S billet tappet cuffs. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna take a torch and try and heat up and get some of that Loctite to loosen up, so that I hope that I don't have this problem. Problem is like if you're reusing the plastic cuffs, you're gonna melt it, so you're gonna ruin it. So you don't want to do this if you're reusing them. So be careful with that bolt if you're trying to reuse that plastic cuff. If not, just grab some S&S tappet billet ones. Is that funny, Fred? Very problematic life. Hey, f you, Fred. Oh, look at that. All right, got the cam plate. I just left the 4 screws from the cam plate to the oil pump attached, just removed it because we're replacing everything. I got the stock cam out, you know what to do with it. And now we got the cam chest opened. I'm going to measure crankshaft runout, and then I need to remove the inner cam bearing, so that's our next step. All right, so we have everything out of the cam chest. One thing we always do in the shop when we're putting cams in is we'll just check the crankshaft runout, make sure that everything is straight. Depending on whether you're installing an S&S or a Feuling product, they all have kind of their own specs that they recommend staying within. So I have the Feuling crankshaft runout tool here, so I'll get it installed. So now that I got it installed, it's still in gear. I'll just spin the rear wheel to turn the motor over. So this one's actually pretty straight. It's only a 2 thou. That's pretty good out of the factory. Bike's got a few miles on it, so that's well within spec, both Feuling and S&S. So now, once we know that's good to go, I'm gonna go ahead and remove that inner cam bearing. It's gonna be another special tool that you're gonna need. One of you steal my 1.125". I bet you Steedy put it over here. All right, I got the Jim's tool installed, ready to remove that inner cam bearing. So that gets us completely disassembled, everything removed, the crankshaft is checked, everything's ready to go back together. So before we start assembling, let's talk about all the parts that we're gonna be putting in this thing. All right, so I have all my parts laid out here. I have my Woods 22XD with the new inner cam bearing. We're using S&S adjustable push rods with black pushrod covers. We're selling this guy some black lifter covers. We have the S&S cam plate, the S&S oil pump. This is specific to whether it's oil or water cooled, so make sure you have the right one. You're also going to need an oil seal to go on the back of the oil pump. Make sure you have that. Like I said earlier, we have the S&S tappet cuffs, new S&S lifters, putting a new S&S chain tensioner on there, O-rings for the pump and plate, cam cover gasket, pushrod O-rings, lifter block gaskets, and we're also changing the oil and filter on this bike. Just make sure that everything's clean as that starts to circle oil through the lifters and the pump for the first time. We don't want to just fill that with a bunch of crap. The oil in this bike's pretty dirty, so it needs to be changed. So I'm going to get this cam bearing installed and we'll just get into putting the cam and the plate together and go from there. And this kit here is one that we pieced together for this customer because he wanted to run the Woods cam. You can buy an S&S complete kit that comes with everything you need, or we can piece it together. It's all available at tuckerspeed.com. If you have questions, drop them in the comments, give us a call, shoot us an email. We can help you put a kit together. All right, so I am ready to install the inner cam bearing. I have my Jim's installer. It's the same tool for the M8. The installer and remover are the same tool. What I did kind of off camera though that you didn't see is I went through and I cleaned out all the threads on everything on the lifter covers, the tappet cuffs, cam plate, the cover, cleaned everything out, got it pretty clean and dry now. So now I'm ready to start putting everything together. So I'll get this tool set up here. All right, so I got that pressed in there. One thing I forgot to mention before I started installing it is you want to install that bearing with it's got letters and writing on the outside of the, so you want, once it's installed, you want to be able to see that. So make sure it gets installed that way. We're now ready to start assembling the oil pump. We want to thank our sponsors, the Law Tigers. The Law Tigers are motorcycle accident attorneys. Scott and his crew across the nation ride and they understand our culture. If you've been in a motorcycle accident, the Law Tiger should be your first call.
Give us a call, we'd love to help you out.
Okay, so now we're getting to the point where things are gonna start getting critical. You could screw something up if you don't pay attention, you don't follow the instructions, you don't pay attention to, the order of things. Like I talked about, inner cam bearing is directional. It's gotta go in with the lettering facing out. Oil pump, you wanna make sure this is assembled correctly. I'm gonna take this pump apart and show you on this S&S pump, kind of something that's unique to it. So I'm gonna separate this pump and kind of lay it out in the order I take it apart. Be careful because it's got these little pins, locating pins in it. You don't want to lose those. All right, so this is the back of the oil pump housing. You can see the groove there for the oil seal. We need to make sure it gets in place. It'll kind of snap into place there. The 2 oil rings that come with your kit, you want to make sure you do not forget them. If you forget them, you're going to not have any oil pressure, or you're going to be sending oil into places that it shouldn't be. The kit comes with Disassembly lube. I like to just lube these O-rings up really good. 1, it helps them kind of stay in place. 2, it helps the part kind of slide into it. So I got my O-rings in place already. Before I put the first part of the pump in place, I want to show you this first gear because it is a critical part. You can see on the inside of the gear, there's kind of there's the flats that align it on the crankshaft, like so. But that flat doesn't run all the way to the back of the gear. It only runs 3/4 of the way. And you gotta make sure that I don't know the best way to explain it, but that the 3/4 is on the outside, that the step is towards the inboard side of the crankshaft. Because when it slides in the housing, you'll see on the inside, at the end of the crankshaft, the flat stops. and this will slide in further than that step so that it's relief cut there so that it doesn't interfere where it's not cut on the inside of the crankshaft. So that's one critical part on that S&S oil pump. So I'm going to start to assembly lube everything here, get ready to start going together. So I'm going to get the crankshaft kind of set in some assembly lube and get the inside of the pump. And they send you with 2 bottles with this thing, so don't be afraid to use it. All right, so pump housing going in. This is your oil pickup, goes into the O-ring in the bottom of the case here. Go ahead and get that pushed into the O-ring. You're going to have to push it in until tight fit. So that's all the way engaged into the O-ring. I want to make sure that that gets all the way there. And now remember that step on our first gear. I'm going to give this gear some assembly lube all the way around it. Kind of move the housing around to get this gear to line up. It should slide in and sit flush with the housing. Now I'm going to put in the 2 locating pins. Fill them with assembly lube, and now they want to spring back out. Just keep that in mind. And then we have this separator plate that goes in. And then I'm going to kind of just put some more assembly lube on the separator plate on our second return gear. Slide it onto there. And then I'm going to apply assembly lube to the inside of the housing where that gear is going to live. You know what, I'm going to change that up. I'm going to put the pins in there and get that off. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put the gear in the housing first. So my flats are kind of top and bottom on my crankshaft. So I'll get this lined up and then I'll kind of line. There we go. Make sure your locating pins don't go anywhere. All right, that slid back. The 2 housings met each other all the way, and now we can install the other half of this is the feed gear. So I'm gonna put some assembly lube all over it. Okay. That's got our pump installed. We are ready for the cam and then the plate. I'm going to fill that inner cam bearing now with some assembly lube. I'm going to work it around into the rollers. Okay, so I'm ready to put the plate in, but before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and get my lifters bleeding down. I'm going to start filling them with oil. I have this cool little dill I bought from 9 Finger that fills the lifters with oil. Just take each lifter, that's just filled with clean engine oil, drop them down in there. So I'll show you how to use that here in just a second. Now, if you don't have one of these, I would get one. They're pretty cheap, but if you don't, you can use just an oil can. What you want to do is grab your lifter, like kind of press your nozzle into the fill hole on the side of it. Start to get as much oil in there as you can until it starts to come out to the top. And then it would be ready for install. But I think the better method is to drop them in here, put the lid on. You can use like a Mighty Vac or even your brake bleeder and just apply a little bit of vacuum to this thing. And you'll see the air come out of the lifters as they start to. So I'll just let those sit and the air work out of those while I continue to get my plate, the cam and everything ready to go in. So I've put assembly lube on the inner cam bearing. I've already cleaned the cam. I've cleaned like all the protective material that they come out of the box with. So I'm gonna just put a bunch of assembly lube on the cam. All right, so it's got assembly lube. Next step is plate. I'm going to take assembly lube, put it around the inside where the cam's going to ride, where the pump face will sit, where the pinion shaft goes through. Make sure that's all got. Okay, I'm going to get Loctite on all 6 of my cam plate screws and my 4 oil pump screws. All right, so here is another critical point in the install. Right now, I have all 4 oil pump screws installed, but loose. So they're all, normally I'll go to where they just tighten up and then back them off just a quarter turn. We want to make sure that we get our oil pump alignment. And there's a lot of different methods on how to do this. S&S wants you to leave everything loose, and what you'll want to turn the motor over. It's essentially centering the gears inside that housing. What I like to do is I'll turn it over, and then I'll go ahead and tighten down one of my plate screws while turning it, kind of locking the plate right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and tighten down all of my plate screws and torque them. One thing I do like that the S&S plate has is they're numbered in the order you want to torque them. So I got 1 through 6. I'm going to torque these to 90 to 110 inch-pounds. 1, 2. I'm torquing this to 100 inch-pounds. 3, 4, 5, 6. So now I have all 6 of the plate screws torqued. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my T-handle, start to turn the motor over again, centering that oil pump housing. And while I'm doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and snug down 2 of my pump screws. And then I'll go ahead and torque those down. They are lettered A, B, C, and D. You want to torque them in that sequence. Again, to 90 to 110 inch-pounds. I'm at 100 inch-pounds there. That's got our plate and pump torqued. I'm going to turn this over so the flat on the pinion shaft is at the 12 o'clock position, facing straight up towards my cam. And then we should be ready for the gears and gear alignment. Okay, got the plate, we got the pump torqued. Our next step is chain alignment. I made a mark on my chain, just noting that this is the outside, so the direction of the chain gets put back in the same way. I'm gonna pull the gears off the chain. Now the cam sprocket spacer that we pulled off is a 100 thou. We'll go ahead and check alignment with that one and we'll see where we're at. So the splines on the cam have 1 double spline. It'll line up with the gear. Install the crank sprocket there. All right, so I got those snugged down. I'm going to install the sprocket holder tool. Basically locks them from rotating. Then I'm going to torque them. That's a special tool. That's another Jim's tool. I think you can buy them from HD. I think you can find them on Amazon. All right, so the torque just for this test is 15 foot-pounds. Now what we want to do is put a straight edge across that. Okay, so I got these torqued to 15 foot-pounds. I'm going to put a straight edge across both gears. You don't want to have any more than 9 thou of play or gap on the top or bottom. It's kind of tricky to measure. This one looks to be pretty flush. So you'll just set your straight edge up across the sprockets and see if you can run the straight edge between, or run your feeler gauge between the straight edge and the gear, trying to make sure that they sit flush on both gears. This one's pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and just leave that 100 thou shim that I have in there. So I'm going to pull these back off, put the chain on, torque it to the final spec. Okay, this is another critical point, cam chain timing. Right now we have the crankshaft, the pinion shaft with the flat facing the 12 o'clock position. The double spline is also in the 12 o'clock position. I have my chain with my paint mark, noting that it's the outside back on. And I have the 2 sprockets installed right now with the timing marks installed. So you'll notice that the double spline on the cam sprocket is at 12 and the flat on the pinion shaft is at 12. So we'll go ahead and get those slid onto place. Everything lines up and your cam is timed correctly. So I'm going to throw some red Loctite on these 2 bolts for the cam and pinion shaft. I'm going to reinstall my sprocket locker. The S&S instructions tell you to follow the factory service manual instructions here, and they are torque both of these to 15 foot-pounds. So the factory service manual says torque to 15, back them off a quarter, and then retorque. Pinion shaft will torque to 24, and the cam sprocket will torque to 34. All right, I have a new S&S chain tensioner. I'm gonna put some blue Loctite on these screws. The other thing I like to do is I like to preload this tensioner with oil. Let's take my oil can, kind of pump it up a little bit, get some oil inside there. If you put oil in there, you kind of have to bleed it off by pushing it up against the chain. I just like that. That way when we fire it up for the first time, it doesn't have a bunch of slack in it. And we're gonna go ahead and torque these to 90 to 110 inch-pounds. I'm gonna get my cam cover on, and then I'm gonna put my lifters together. Load up all these bolts with Loctite. All right, so I got my cam cover installed. The reason I put the cam cover on before I do my lifters is I like to kind of preload these lifter bores with some oil, kind of also get some oil down into the cam compartment. So this is kind of draining down the lifter bore, kind of draining over the top of the cam lobes, settling in the bottom of the cam chest. All right, so these have been sitting in our vacuum jar here. I'm just gonna give it another pump up just to see if I can get any more air out of them. Okay, so I got all 4 lifters in place. Clean up some of that oil that's coming off of them. Okay, next step after we get the lifters installed is to install the S&S tappet cuffs. These are marked front and rear. I'm gonna go ahead and start with the rear cylinder here, get the cuff put in place. My procedure is a little bit different than the S&S instructions. I actually have 2 loose feeler gauges pulled out of the stack here. I have a 2 and a 3 thou feeler gauge. And what I do is slide it in between the lifter and the cuff, and then I fold it over, put it on the top side, kind of creating a loop like that. And I do that on both intake and exhaust lifter. That's going to kind of center the cuff over the 2 lifters, and then I'll install the bolt and torque it down right there. Go ahead and torque these to 100 inch-pounds, and then you'll remove the feeler gauges, and kind of as a double check, you'll spin the motor over again, making sure that the lifters don't bind in the cuff. You want to see them kind of freely falling back down with the cam lobe. I'm going to roll this over because you can see this exhaust lifter on the front cylinder is the cam lobe is pushing it up. I'm just going to roll the motor over until they're both down low. At that moment, the rear cylinder exhaust is up. Same procedure, loop the feeler gauges up over the top. You kind of see the 2 loops there. That takes care of the tappet cuffs. I'm going to install, we're putting new black lifter covers on this one. The tappet cuffs actually come with new bolts for the covers, and then we'll be ready for push rod adjustment at that point. Okay, so it is push rod adjustment time or push rod installation time. I've unpackaged everything. I'm using a set of S&S Quickie push rods here with new covers, and it comes with all the O-rings and everything. One thing I wanted to cover real quick and kind of show you is how to assemble these tubes, because I see so many bikes come in where guys have installed their own cams or push rods, and these things are installed upside down, parts in the wrong places. So first off, the S&S tubes don't come with their own spring, so we have to rob the spring out of the old push rod tubes. It does come with a new washer. So we have the inner tube, then the collar, then the spring, the washer, and then a new inner tube O-ring. Slide that all the way up and then slide it onto the lower tube, and you'll have kind of the tapered lip here. The one with the shoulder will sit in the tappet cuff. The tapered one will go up and seal against that O-ring. So I'll slide this down. You'll kind of see, so you see the inner tube, the collar, spring, washer, O-ring, and the tube will come up and seal against the O-ring. So I'll get all the rest of these installed in that order. It's normal for these to kind of get rusted. They get a lot of grime on them, so I like to just kind of clean them up a little bit before we go back together. They're kind of underneath that collar. Even though you can't see them, they are just exposed to the elements because they're not behind the seal. So if they are rusted like that, it's not a huge concern. The way these S&S tubes come out of the package, the washer is above the collar, which is incorrect, and a lot of people think that that's because it came out of the package that way, that's where it goes, and that's incorrect. So you got to pull it all apart, pull the washer off, and reinstall everything in the correct order. All right, so the push rod tubes are assembled and ready. I'm gonna go ahead and install my O-rings in the lifter covers and in the cylinder heads. Don't forget those ones. There's nothing worse than getting your push rods all adjusted and then realize you don't have the O-rings in there and you gotta take them all back apart. I like to put a little bit of oil on these, not a lot, kind of lightly coat them. Makes it easier for the tube to kind of pop into place. So I just go ahead and install all 4 right now. All 4 of those are installed. I'm gonna double check, but I'm pretty sure I left the motor the last time I turned it over at top dead center compression on the rear cylinder. Now this is another point where a lot of people get confused, is trying to find the correct spot to do the push rod adjustment. Top dead center compression is where you want it. I'm actually not there on the front cylinder. So what I'm doing is I'm reaching in the front cylinder and I'm feeling the lifters go up and down with the cam lobes. So they're not moving right now. So I'm going to check the rear. So there's a point where I can rock the wheel back and forth and I can feel the rear cylinder lifters, the intake and exhaust. One's just closing and one's just starting to open. And if I rock it back and forth in the same place, I feel no movement on the front cylinder. That means that neither of those two cam lobes are doing anything to the lifter right now. They're facing down. And that's where you want to install the push rods on the front cylinder. You want no movement on the lifters. You don't want that lifter to be, or the cam to be pushing the lifter up, and then you make the adjustment on that and then it moves down. These S&S push rods, these are all for the same length, just depending on the brand you're using. Sometimes you will have like a different intake and exhaust. Just double check them all the time. And go ahead and slide push rod into the tube. Start with the intake. Now I just use an elastic band and a paper clip. I hook up here on the rocker box, bolt, and just hold that push rod tube up and out of the way so that I can access the adjustment. I'm going to start to thread this out, expanding the push rod. Kind of have to hold the lock nut up until you get threads exposed that the lock nut will hang on to. So I'm holding the push rod and the lock nut and turning the lower portion of the push rod right now. Constantly kind of like wiggling it, making sure that I'm centered. I'm also holding it up so it stays engaged up in the rocker. And I'm getting close now. My lock nut is on the threads. There's still a little bit of up and down movement there, so I haven't quite got to that zero lash point. Now the first step is to find zero lash, and that's just where there's no up and down movement. We just barely have contacted the top of the lifter. Right there I can move it up and down just a little bit. You want to make sure that you're not pushing the plunger down in the lifter as well. All right, so basically have that push rod expanded to zero lash right there. I have no up and down movement with it. So these S&S push rods, they have 32 threads per inch. They're a 4-turn push rod. Some guys count it by the flats. I just do turns. What I do is I go ahead and I mark my push rod with a paint pen, which I bet somebody stole. I just had it last night. You already stole it back? Right where? Oh, right there, right in front of my face. We're at zero lash. I'm taking my yellow paint pen. I've made a yellow dot on the push rod just above the hex on the push rod, not the lock nut. Basically, you can see I put a yellow dot right there. That way I can put my wrench on the hex. It doesn't rub off or anything like that. So you're gonna need 2 7/16 wrenches and a 1/4 inch wrench to do it. Right now I just need to hold the bottom half with the 1/4, and then I'm just gonna go ahead and start counting my 4 turns from this point. So I'm turning the upper half of the push rod right now. So there's 1 turn. 2, 3, 4. Now the tricky part. Me personally, I like to put a little bit of Loctite on these threads before I lock down the lock nut. I'm going to spin the lock nut up against the upper part of the push rod there. Now the key here is to lock the lock nut down without changing the adjustment. So what I do is I hold the lower portion and then I hold the upper portion with the same hand, making sure, yeah, kind of like chopsticks. And then I take my second 7/16 wrench and I just turn the lock nut, making sure that neither the upper or lower portions move, changing my adjustment. Make sure that's locked down. And then after I'll just kind of put them so I can make sure it's tight. So that one is adjusted. It's already spinning by hand, which is pretty normal for a brand new lifter. If you can't spin it, you need to wait for that lifter to bleed off. It might take 5 or 8 minutes, but it already is spinning freely. So I can go ahead and move over to the exhaust side. Pretty much same procedure. New push rod, slide it up in there. All right, so I swapped out this paper clip just to hold both of these open for this video. At this point, I have both the exhaust and intake adjusted, and they are both spinning freely. I can spin them by hand, so I'm safe to turn the motor over and get ready to do the rear cylinder at this point. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just kind of add a little bit of paint marker here so that you guys can see what's happening to the push rods when I'm getting ready to do the rear cylinder. So I'm gonna roll this thing over. I'm just gonna roll it over a couple of times, make sure that the front, everything's set and in place. You can see them traveling up and down. So I'm gonna just feel the rear cylinder lifters, feel the exhaust opening, now the intake and it closing. You can see the exhaust on the front cylinder opening right there. Now I'm at that point that I was talking about where the front cylinder, the exhaust is just closing and the intake is just opening. And I have zero movement when I'm rocking the wheel back and forth on the rear cylinder. So I'm good to go on the rear. So I'll go ahead and get the rear installed and adjusted and we should be set. Okay, got all four installed and adjusted. I can turn these freely by hand, so I'm good to go to rotate the motor over. Just double check everything. Okay, everything's set there. Pull these elastics out of the way. You get the push rods engaged down into the lower O-ring. Now here's another part of this that I've seen a lot of guys screw up. This is the placement of this collar. A lot of guys will push the collar and the inner tube all the way up and then put the keeper there, and that's incorrect. Slide the inner tube all the way up. Make sure it engages into the O-ring up there in the head, and then the collar stays in the center, and you'll install the keeper. The keeper will basically engage or push up on the inner tube like that, and then it'll be spring loaded from the spring underneath the collar. Now I have my pushrod keeper installer tool, which makes life pretty easy. I like to push in and make sure that's pushed all the way against the inner tube, and then I like to give them just a little bit of a spin, make sure nothing's going anywhere. I'll show you another way to install these keepers. It's a little more dangerous because you can scratch your pushrod covers. You take just a little flathead screwdriver, push the keeper all the way up into the head, and then push down, go underneath the keeper, and then on top of the spring-loaded collar, push down, and then push the keeper in place there. Problem is if you come out and your screwdriver scratches against the collar, you leave a big scratch in it. If it's a customer's bike, he's probably gonna be pissed. If it's yours, it's your fault. Make sure those are engaged, just give them a little twist. Fronts are good. Okay, that is pushrod installation and adjustment. Pushrod covers are in place. Keepers are above the collars. Everything is set. All I got left now, I need to put the throttle body and intake back on, put the pipe back on. This bike, I'm gonna drain the engine oil while I do all that, put fresh fluid in it, and it'll be ready for a first startup, and then it'll be heading to the dyno room. All right, so I got the exhaust all installed, the O2 sensors hooked back up, made sure everything was routed, clipped in all the clips, zip tied up out of the way so they don't go anywhere, they don't rub on anything or get pinched. Just gotta throw the throttle body in the intake, throw some oil in it, and we'll be all done with this. Okay, I got the pipe installed, the intake's all put together, I did the oil change, I'm ready for the first fire up, and then we're gonna be moving this thing over into the dyno room. All right guys, so we got this cam install all wrapped up. We just got the bike out of the dyno room. I'm hoping that this video has helped you guys out. Hopefully we covered all the important pieces and important parts where like you could really get this thing screwed up if you don't do it right. Cam timing, push rod adjustment, kind of getting the motor to top dead center. Hopefully we've covered all that good enough. If you still have questions, please just drop them in the comments below or shoot us an email. We'd love to try and help you guys out. Like I said, we got this bike through the dyno room, made some pretty good increases. We ended up at 120 horse, 128 foot-pounds of torque, which ends up being about a 30 horsepower gain from the way it rolled in with just the pipe and air cleaner only upgrade. We made a whole other video on this bike through the dyno process that you could check out. With this, we did the full tune. The torque line had kind of a weird dip in it that we weren't really happy with, so we ended up going in and modifying the exhaust and making the exhaust a little bit more tunable, and ended up kind of straightening out that torque line. So check that video out if you're interested in seeing that stuff. Hopefully the rest of this has been helpful. Stay tuned, we got a bunch more videos coming out all year. Thanks.